Hello, friends. Thanks again for joining me on Extraordinary Connection. Today, we honor and say goodbye to a lunch counter sitter, a freedom rider, a protest marcher, an orator, a congressman, and the conscience of our Congress, John Lewis. John Lewis was born into poverty in rural Alabama to sharecropper parents in the midst of the segregated South. And from an early age, John dreamt of being a minister. So once he was old enough, he went to Nashville, Tennessee to become a Baptist minister. He arrived in Nashville just as a group of young black students began a series of nonviolent, peaceful lunch counter sit-ins to protest segregation in public places. John met the organizer, the Reverend James Lawson, a Methodist pastor who studied and promoted peaceful, nonviolent protests for activism. And it was because of Reverend Lawson's tutelage that John Lewis remained an activist and nonviolent protester his whole life. Through the work of the protesters, segregated lunch counters were abolished in Nashville, and John then continued his penchant to get into good, necessary trouble, which he explained in a later interview to mean, when you see something not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to speak up. And because he spoke up, John was arrested, beaten, mocked, and threatened numerous times while getting into his good trouble. After the lunch counter protest, John and 12 others organized a movement called the Freedom Riders. Earlier, the Supreme Court had ruled that segregation and public transportation was illegal, but it was still practiced in the rural South. The Freedom Riders, made up of whites and blacks, men and women, rode a Greyhound bus from Washington, D.C. down to New Orleans. And as a rider, John was beaten for trying to enter white-only waiting rooms, beaten for riding in the first place, and he was arrested multiple times. The final arrest was in Mississippi, where he and the other riders were sent to prison for 40 days. But their actions and their visibility reshed light on the segregated practice, and finally, public transportation in the South was integrated. Next, John was one of the organizers and one of the speakers at the March on Washington, the 300,000 people march that came to voice their support on a national civil rights bill. Remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech? Well, he gave his speech at the March on Washington. And John Lewis spoke just before Martin Luther King Jr. I've linked his speech in the video description on YouTube if you'd like to listen. John was there on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that march from Selma to Montgomery. That bloody Sunday where the police beat the peaceful protesters. John was in front of the march that morning and was the first one struck by the police. And John was there when President Johnson signed the Voter Rights Act in 1965, along with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. John stayed active in civil rights his whole life. In the late 60s and 70s, John worked with an organization called the Voter Education Project, whose mission was to help minorities get registered to vote, and they helped over 4 million get their right to vote. He entered politics, serving on the Atlanta City Council, and later was voted a congressman for the state of Georgia to the United States Congress, where John served for 30 years until his death last week. John never stopped fighting injustice. He never stopped championing the rights of marginalized and the oppressed. He never stopped being the conscience for Congress, calling our representatives to task when the rights of the people were in jeopardy. And through it all, through the beatings and the setbacks, through his imprisonments and the glacial speed of change that happens in national politics, John never gave up hope. In his own words in an interview with Oprah, John said, "I never lost that sense of hope, even being in pain or being in jail. You have to have hope. When you lose that sense of hope, that sense of optimism, it's like giving up." John's hope was biblical. His optimism for a better world, a world marked by justice, peace, and equality for all people, is biblical. And his philosophy of keeping hope is torn right out of Jeremiah 29:11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declare the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, and plans to give you hope and a future." So my question for you this morning is, how are you getting into good trouble? Where and how are you speaking out against injustice in the world? Whether that's in your local community or on a bigger platform, what cause or issue do you need to lend your voice to? Because the world does need your voice. The world needs your advocacy and your passion and your hard work for change. And as you find yourself in good trouble, take comfort in the words of Jeremiah 29:11. The Lord does have plans for a hopeful future. It just may take a while. It may not happen in our lifetime, but as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So thank you, John, for your lifetime of getting into good trouble. And thank you, friend, for your work championing injustices in our world today. And until next time, I will see you at extraordinaryconnection.org.